missed this session, we will send out the link to our Apex members after the call. Thank you.
We'll put it on the website.
Yeah, put on the website too. Thank you, Kathy.
You bet.
Yeah, see, I can listen to it some other time.
Okay, let's take this away and let's try to get started. Can everybody hear me and see me? Helen, can you see everything fine?
Yeah, I can see that. Thank
Okay.
you.
But let's get started. Let's talk about sales and operations planning. Some people call it sales, inventory, and operations planning, SIOP. I'm old, so I'm going to stick with S&OP. Today's topic is about why S&OP success is just so darn elusive. Why companies that implement S&OP aren't getting out of it what they originally thought they would get out of it. I'm going to actually show you some statistics that I think are going to surprise everybody, and it's going to cause you to think twice about S&OP and some of the issues in your companies trying to implement S&OP. But before we do that, let's make sure we understand what S&OP is driving. There are 15 functional elements of global supply chain management, 15 major elements. The first major element is about the suppliers. Suppliers, first tier, second tier, third tier, you could keep going. But the category we call suppliers is part of global supply chain management in your company. Global supply chain leaders actually need to understand all of these elements in order to understand what S&OP really does. I'm going to argue tonight that S&OP isn't about software. It isn't mostly about technical capabilities or applications. I'm going to argue that S&OP needs to be thought of as an enabler. It needs to be thought of as an ecosystem enabler to run your manufacturing and or distribution companies. And it starts with understanding your supplier and even your supplier's supplier. And then we have to get products and services from our suppliers to our factory. So there's typically from your suppliers, there's some primary outbound for them, or we're going to call it inbound for us. And then it may go through a distribution center, maybe owned by that supplier, maybe owned by a third party, maybe a 3PL, maybe some other organization. And then there's secondary, or oftentimes referred to as last mile transportation. And then eventually that gets into your manufacturing plant. And it comes in as raw material. And then you plan and schedule and make sure that everything is organized, and make sure that if you're building cars, you have as many right doors as left doors, and trunk lids as you have hood lids, making sure that you have mat sets of parts where necessary. That's about manufacturing provisioning. And then you actually make the product, maybe in your factory, maybe in some subcontractor factories or contract manufacturing facilities. And then eventually you turn that into finished goods. So if you think about what conversion or what manufacturing is, it's taking raw materials from an outside supplier and it's converting them and adding value to them into a marketable, sellable, shippable sort of form. And then after that, now we move into the outbound loop, which is the primary outbound, which again may go through another intermediary, a channel intermediary, oftentimes referred to as a distribution center. And then there's last mile distribution, which ultimately now goes to the customer and maybe also to the consumer. So you may go to the retailer. Imagine you're making candy bars, you ship them off to the customer.
Ladies not let me in, so I can't see the presentation. Oh.
Uh-oh, are we having a problem seeing this?
I don't know what she's doing.
No, I can see it. I wonder who is the number 5083. May want to mute, please.
Some people don't have the link, so I'm trying to send.
Okay.
So I'll.
Would you like me just to wait a second?
I'm working on it.
This is a good place for me to wait. Technology. Oh, we love it.
Yeah, so Ellen, in the current environment, right, we see a lot of disruption in those red circles, squares, and the green ones.
Yep.
Because of the COVID and all the other disruption.
Yeah. I watched while we're waiting for things to be fixed, I watch in California, I watch the inbound port traffic every day. I have a dashboard on my system. I get in every morning. I can see, this morning we have 49 ships sitting offshore. A week ago, we had 44. Those are container ships with between 10,000 and 25,000 containers on them. And there's another 64 en route to the West Coast. That's just Los Angeles. That doesn't count Gateway up in Vancouver, nor does it count Ensenada down in Mexico. And so we have an enormous backlog. We just had a discussion with one of my clients the other day, and I just said for the next 2 years, I don't want to be talking about inventory reduction. I want to be talking about getting the stuff we need. And because lead time is your enemy now, not inventory levels. Everybody can take that to your CFO, say, Alan Dunn said that. That's fine with me. That inventory is not your enemy right now. Lead time is your enemy. And we're going to be here for 2 years, by the way. We're not going to get out of this shortage of labor, shortage of transportation, shortage of supply, shortage of components, shortage of semiconductors. We're not going to shortage of containers. We're not going to get out of that for 2 years. It's mathematically impossible. So,
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah,
let's jump in.
Yeah. Kathy, are you ready to go? Yeah.
I have everybody sent. Kathy Bosher says she's in my personal meeting room. I don't know where that is. So I sent her in an
All
email.
right, I'm going to get going and hopefully everybody
Yep.
will.
Yep. Thank you,
okay.
Ellen. Thank you.
So where we left off on the talking about this kind of end of the loop. It seemed like the end of the loop. Last 9 years, something has changed. There's another step in here. After we get to the products to the customer, then we have to ultimately see it to the consumer. And so you've got that consumer interface. And then sometimes the consumer doesn't like it and it has to come back. So we call that reverse or return logistics. Amazon, of course, has popularized and developed the processes to make that reasonably routine. And they've really made that customer facing and very successful. Now, I share this with you because these 15 elements are what we as supply chain professionals have to manage on a day in and day out basis. Sales and operations planning really has to understand the demand, which comes from knowledge and experience and logic and understanding customers, consumers, the customer-consumer interface, and also understanding all the market conditions that go on. I will tell you that my experience has been that the reason sales and operations planning fails most often on a technical basis, not an organizational cultural behavior, but on a technical basis, is poor forecasts. And those poor forecasts are almost always the result of really poor market research, really poor market analysis. A solid data-driven analysis of what drives customers to buy and want to take delivery and want to open their wallets and pay for a product it's a data science. It's not a subjective science. It is definitely data-driven. And a lot of companies just do not put the rigor into their market plans. The average manufacturing company I visit, if I said, describe to me in technical terms all the demographic information about your customers segmented by groups, however you want to segment. Tell me all the geographic information. Tell me the psychographic information. By the time I get to psychographic, they're usually lost. And so sales and operations planning really depends on understanding what's in that yellow box as a start. But then we drop down to finished goods. It's also about understanding what you have to ship today or what you're going to have to ship very soon, and that's finished goods. And knowing what your finished goods are on a global basis, where finished goods might be distributed across warehouses, some that you don't even own, some that might be third parties, is not the easiest thing in the world. And then the manufacturing provisioning over there, planning the factory, establishing firm planned orders to drive the factory. Forecasts should not drive factories. Virtually never should a forecast drive a factory. I'll say that again. You should decouple demand from the plan, the highest level plan for the factory. That's what sales and operations planning or S&OP does. It's actually a decoupling technique that says, let's create a demand. Let's make sure we believe the demand. Now let's figure out the rate at which we want to produce in our Singapore factory, in our Los Angeles factory, in our Rio de Janeiro factory. And then let's figure that out on a global basis. And that's a very complex process and a very complex set of tasks but it can be done, and it is done effectively in some companies. Now, the functional elements of S&OP are pretty straightforward. It's demand planning, oftentimes referred to as forecasting. It's master production scheduling, which is the determining the firm planned orders for factories, the marching order for the factories, if you will. And it's target inventory planning, which is really risk management. You have to think about target inventory planning isn't about traditional inventory planning. It's about how do I minimize risks in my marketplace of a competitor getting a sale because I don't have products, or how do I minimize risk on a new product introduction where I have very little data to go by, or how do I minimize risks on a changeover from product A to product B in the marketplace. So target inventory planning is about identifying what you should either have in stock or should be near stock during transition points, obsoleting old, moving to new, going from one market to another market. I give you a great example. Many, many years ago, we did a project for a company called Carl Karcher Enterprises. Carl Karcher, if you lived on the West Coast of the US, and I think there's some on the East Coast, it's a hamburger chain. And so they had regular French fries. I think they bought Hardee's a number of years ago. So for those of you in the eastern half of the US, you might recognize that. And they sold French fries. And then they came out with this idea of the seasoned curly fry. And so we were engaged to try to figure out what the demand for the seasoned curly fries would be. But it wasn't just that. We had to figure out, would it in fact erode the share of regular French fries? So we did a fairly exhaustive amount of analysis of the marketplace. And we ultimately came to the conclusion and said, all the data says that for the first 8 months after you introduce it, sales of fries in general are going to skyrocket because people are going to buy both. Not every person, but a good number are going to buy them, or they're going to alternate from one visit to your store to the next. And you're going to see an increase in both fry sales, but primarily the curly fries. And we said, after they start to develop a pattern, that will drop down. It's just, what we refer to as relative erosion patterns. They start to calm down and they decide that they want regular fries or curly fries. And then we would see some stability in the marketplace. And that's exactly what happened. And the client kept saying, I can't believe when we introduced that total fry sales will go up. We said, yes, they will. And here's all the data. Here's all the geographic, the demographic, and the psychographic or buyer behavior data that supports that. Therefore, here's what we need to have in target inventory of curly fries and target inventory of regular fries. This is really an important point because these are the three main functional elements of sales and operations planning. And this is a profession. S&OP is a profession. The people that run the demand management side, the forecasting professionals, their job is to predict demand at the family level and sometimes at the SKU level. The job is also to rationalize demand. This is why you never put a demand planner in that role that doesn't have broad, strong market research capabilities and background and experience, because they have to rationalize demand. Anytime you see the word rationalize, that means use judgment. They also have to share the demand with others around the company, and they have to be able to share what's going on. And ultimately, they're the ones who put together the revenue plan, not finance, not the budgeting folks, not even the marketing people. The demand planners really, their job's not done until they put forth a revenue plan. Now, the target inventory planners, as I talked about, their job is to manage the supply demand risks, again, at the family and maybe even the SKU level. Their job is to develop kind of an ending inventory, end of month, end of period, end of quarter, whatever, that mitigates the supply and demand risks. Their job is also to achieve working capital targets. Now, as you know, inventory is the largest element and the most volatile element of working capital. Inventory has oftentimes been referred to as the giant sucking sound of capital. It tends to drive one's capital down. Would I rather have money sitting in the form of cash in my bank accounts, or would I rather have it in greasy weldments? Or would I rather have it in semi-finished goods? Every step along the way where you add more value to a product, you actually increase risk. So for example, I can buy sheets, if I'm an auto manufacturer, I can buy sheets of aluminum, rolls of aluminum. And I can use that for any model I make that uses aluminum. But as soon as I turn it into a door, I can't use it as a hood. I can't use it as a dashboard. It's got to be a door. And as soon as that door is formed to be a certain model, I can't use it for another model. And so every step along the way increases the risk of either a stock out or a surplus. This is one of the reasons why it's important to reduce cycle times and cumulative lead times, because that actually dramatically reduces risk in any company. In other words, figure out how to make to order is what we all should be aspiring to do. On the master scheduling side, I have to plan the production rates. I have to plan them again at the highest level, usually at the family and the model level, sometimes the SKU. I have to rationalize those plans for against what I'm seeing as market demands. Although my job as a master scheduler is not to question the demand. If the demand is put together, my job, let me say this again, my job as a master production scheduler is not to question the demand. My job is to meet the demand and do it with an efficient factory, utilizing my assets and my resources appropriately. Those are the things that I have to do. And just as the sales professional's job was to create a revenue plan, or the demand planner's job was to create a revenue plan, my job as master scheduler is to create the COGS plan. Revenue minus COGS, guess what? S&OP is the organization that should give you your margin plan, not the finance department, not the budget department, not the accounting department, not the marketing department, and not the operations function or department. It's the S&OP organization or entity that should be providing the revenue plan to the senior level executives, providing the COGS plan, and providing the margin plan that comes from those. Any other way of thinking is old thinking. It's old school. It's old command and control thinking. This is a bit broader than that. You know, S&OP is both a messaging system and a triggering tool. By messaging, I mean that the people in supply and demand are getting all the same messages. They understand what's going on. This is why S&OP has to actually be an organization in the org chart. It's not a person from over here does some demand planning and a person from this department does some production. No. S&OP works best when it's a singular organization. And I'll let you be thinking for a minute, who should it report to? Because I'm going to tell you in a minute who it should report to.
Hey,
S&OP, however, is also a triggering tool. S&OP triggers behavior, just the same way a firearm has a trigger. In this case, what the trigger pulls is a firm planned order. It creates a firm planned order. That firm planned order is what drives a factory. Factories are not driven by demand. They're driven by master production schedule firm planned orders. MPS is not supposed to be, hey, just go build stuff, shoot. No, it's supposed to be ready, aim, shoot, or understand the demand, plan the production rate that gets you both efficiency and meets the demands, and then create the firm planned orders and release them and let them, whether it's through MRP or just in time or Kanban or DDMRP or whatever other sets of technical tools you have, let that drive the sub-level requirements all the way to the lowest possible level, to the supplier level.
Hey, Ellen, sorry to interrupt. We have a question from the audience.
Sure.
Regards to the comment you made. Master scheduler planning is not to question demand. Whose role is this then?
Whose role is it to question demand? That's a great question. It's a demand planner's job to question the demand. And there's a process that I'm going to talk about, the sales and operations planning meetings that have to happen. And so usually by the second week of every month, because S&OP meetings need to happen at the very least frequent once a month, and maybe even more often than that, but they must happen once a month at the very least. And so the sales, the demand planners bring in the forecast and they say, here's the forecast. Here's why we think this is the forecast. Here's why we think this is rational. There's discussion. Eventually, within days, they finalize that. And then that's the demand plan marching orders. That's then handed over to the master production scheduler. His or her job is to try to figure out how to build that, but not to question. The time for questioning is gone. At that point in time, their job. Now look, there's always some things that change if your
Probably do you want to go to?
your key customer's factory burns down or building burns down.
Do you have your phone?
Okay, so there
We go
are
maps and see what the closest one is. I'm on the Zoom stupid meeting.
Let's go up there.
On Lake Michigan.
It's not that far away.
It's like
we have a little
Alpine's
noise
quicker,
going
but-
on there.
Can someone mute?
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So the answer to that question is very simple. It's the demand planner's job to put together a reliable, believable, rationalized demand plan. And you'll see how this works in a little bit when I get to the organization structure. But now what I want to talk about is this, about what S&OP is. You're never going to get success if you keep thinking it's just a technical set of tools. S&OP is really a manufacturing ecosystem enabler that demands excellence in technical, organizational, cultural, and behavioral interfaces to find success in this supply and demand equation. Now, let me explain those a little bit more. What do I mean by technical elements or technical layer, if you will? Well, I'm talking about accurate data, good information, algorithms that work to reconcile marketplace demands and calculate optimal conversion tactics to meet those demands. In other words, I'm talking about the tool that SAP provides or Oracle provides. I'm also talking about the tools internally you use to keep your lead times, lot sizes, safety stocks, order multiples accurate. I'm talking about all the tools, the technical, almost all information and digital tools that you need to do your job. I'm also talking organizationally about who does what, about the definition of roles and responsibilities and accountabilities. I will tell you that sales should stop, and people are they write me about this all the time, should stop demanding salespeople put together forecasts, because here's the way it goes. On the last day of the month at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, somebody says, Ralph, I need that forecast for next month. Ralph just goes, okay, let's see, last month, 2% plus, that's it. We just add a couple percent to it. And that's what it is. And there's no rationale behind that. It's as close to arbitrary as one can get. That's not the kind of demand planning that we're talking about. If you go and look at any of the material written by the Institute of Business Forecasting, IBF, it's a kind of a sister organization to ASCM. If you look at some of the stuff and some of the works that they've written, they talk about the profession of the demand planner. That phrase is used all the time, the profession of the demand planner. And that's not a salesperson's job is to close orders. The demand planner's job is to figure out what markets we should be going after. What's the competitive analysis between ours and our competitors' products? Where should we focus? Where's the important few separated from the trivial many? Their job is to figure all this out. They are accountable for the quality of the demand plan. And that then gets handed over to the master scheduler, which we'll talk about in a minute, because I want to finish this one up. Culturally, the cultural level in this ecosystem enabler called S&OP is really around how to drive sustainable execution within the context of enterprise, your company, your enterprise's beliefs and value systems. If your enterprise doesn't value accurate demand plans, but does seemingly value extraordinary expediting efforts, heroism of solving today's shortage, then you're going to have a problem getting S&OP to work. We have to build a belief and value system in the company that actually supports this discipline of sales and operations planning. And then behavioral. This is about how we shape individuals and team approaches to demand and supply conflicts. So the behavioral is about the conflict. Look, how many of us have been in an S&OP meeting where somebody says, the demand planner says, well, all the demand adds up to $10 million. And here's how I got to the 10 million. And the CEO or COO or somebody says, well, that's really great. You did a great job, but it has to be 15 million. And then you have to say, well, but it only adds up to 10 million. Yeah, but it needs to be 15. Well, if you plug 15 in there, all it's going to do is drive excess inventory. And so we need to have as good a data behind the demand, such good data behind the demand that we actually can come back and say to that president or COO, you've asked for 15 million. My data's so good that I can do it in reverse and I can tell you how you're going to get to the 15 what we need to do to price, what we need to do to delivery, what we need to do to market penetration. I can tell you the things we need to invest in to get you to the 15, but based on the current strategies, we're not going to get there. And so, in other words, conflict management is a key element. Conflict resolution, I should say, is a key element in sales and operations planning, and almost is never taught. We have this wonderful course. It's of all the 100+ courses I've developed in my career, the one I'm the most proud of is our course called the Essential S&OP course. And part of that course is a whole section, a whole lesson with 3 videos on just how to resolve these kinds of business conflicts. And everybody who takes the course, when they get to that, they all say, do we really need to do that? And by the time they get through it, they all say, well, that's what's missing from my S&OP, the ability to work through conflicts and to resolve them. Now, S&OP is supposed to keep you focused on the customers and on service, customer service, and on factory management and on capital efficiency. To put it bluntly, S&OP is about helping you to understand the acceptable and reliable delivery levels and rates to the customers, to support the efficiencies in your manufacturing, we call them conversion efficiencies, and to provide for minimal or optimal raw materials, work in process, and finished goods inventories. But unfortunately, it doesn't quite work out that way in a lot of companies. So 2020 was a tough year for all of us. March of 2020, I sat in my office for 2 weeks answering the phone. Every training program, virtually every training program, every factory design and development project, everything, every recruiting project in our recruiting division, just canceled. And so by the end of March, we said, wow, we just went from the projection of the best year in the history of my company to the worst year, literally as bad as the first and second year of its history back in 1980 and 81, when we just started it. Well, we sat about and said, well, if you believe that this is going to come back and it's going to be fixed, what do we do in this period of time? Well, we said, well, let's go do a study. Let's keep our people busy by doing some studies and by doing some analysis. So that's what we did. So in our training organization called the Manufacturing Executive Institute, we put together a very interesting S&OP study. And a lot of what you're hearing today came out of the revelations from that study. So we surveyed 3,227 manufacturing companies in the US, Canada, and the Mexican border towns. So it was 8 of them, Tijuana, Mexicali, Juarez, Matamoros, and I don't remember the others, but there was 8 of them. And whoops, go back here a second. And so we actually ended up talking to 1,100 or talking and interviewing, as well as just getting survey data from 1,143 CEOs or COOs in the companies that we went after. So that's a pretty high response rate, and 722 heads of either S&OP, demand planning, master scheduling, or what was called master planning as well. So we ended up getting kind of the S&OP people, about 722 of them, over 1,100 CEOs and COOs. And we started to look at the data from the study, and here's what we discovered. So I'm just going to give you 6 questions. There was 18 questions in the survey, but 6 of them really tell the story. Does your company have a sales and operations planning function and or department? 16% said yes, 62% said no. And when we went back and talked to a lot of them, the reason they said no was because they said, we don't really have a function or department. It's just kind of informal. Oh, that's interesting. 22% didn't know. What's really interesting is 84% were in the no to don't know. That was shocking to us. This is like having a train and you forgot the engine. How does that work? How does the train move? We then asked them to rate the effectiveness of their S&OP function, and only 8% rated it as effective, and 3% are very effective, and 3% effective. 11% good, 52% fair, 15% poor, and so on. If you just take a look at fair and poor, it was 2/3 of the respondents. 2/3 of the respondents, 67%, said the effectiveness of S&OP is fair to poor. So now I have the engine on the train, but apparently I don't have fuel for it or something, or I don't have people to operate it. The third question was, on average, how accurate are your forecasts? So now we're talking about demand planning side at the family level. And at the family level, we talked about, are they between 95 and 100%, 90 and 95, 85, 90, so on and so forth. And you'll see that nobody had over 95%. What's really interesting is that 81% of them said their forecasts are less than 75% accurate. You know, for a small company where you can see all your product every day, that's probably workable. But for a larger company, especially a multi-plant environment, that's just deadly. Might as well be 50% or 75%. That just is an unworkable situation. So the forecasts were, you know, less than 75% accurate for 81%. And that's at the family level. We did ask the same question about the SKU or stock keeping unit, the part number level, if you will. And to make it go quickly here, 87%, even more of them said it was less than 70. And we would have expected that because, you know, as you get closer to the end product, you know, forecasts tend to become less accurate. The higher level you forecast, the more accurate. The shorter in you forecast. So forecasting tomorrow is usually easier than forecasting out a year. And so we would have expected that. But still, at the end of the day, 87% of the respondents said that their forecasts were less than 75% accurate at the part number level or the final end item SKU level. We also asked them about on-time delivery to customers, and you can see the segmentation here. You had some good news here about, if you take a look at the 90% and above, you had about 29%, getting close to a third. Unfortunately, down here in the between 75 and 85, between 65 and 75%, and less than 65. So what that says is that 49% or half of the respondents said they're able to deliver less than 85% of the time on time. That's a pretty big prescription for losing customers. We know from work that Gardner's done and Stanford Research has done, we know that when you drop down below 85%, you have a higher probability that customer's not going to return than they will return. So this becomes kind of a tipping point sort of number. Now, we couldn't leave inventory out, so we asked them, relative to your peers, how does your company turn its inventory? And 91% said they turn it the same or worse relative to their peer competitors and peer companies. So that's hard data. It's hard data. It's not even a year old.
Ellen,
Our conclusion is there's clearly an S&OP effectiveness crisis. And the question is it an effectiveness crisis because of bad demand management, bad master production scheduling, bad target inventory planning, or is it a failure on the technical, the organizational, the cultural, and the behavioral levels? We think probably it is, in fact, on those levels. So we have this moment of wisdom that we want to share with you. S&OP is a positive cultural and behavioral enabler that enables disparate voices in the supply and the demand and the various levels of those to be heard. The questions are as important in an S&OP meeting as the answers. That it enables constructive conflict. It actually, the whole point of S&OP is to create that conflict between those who think they know everything about the marketplace and those who think they know everything about the efficiency of the factories and the capabilities of the factories. And when they have constructive, not destructive, constructive conflict, then they usually find out things they never knew before. It enables the ability to compromise and define. And so you'll know that S&OP is working when you hear someone from sales says, well, I know I need this customer's delivered, but I'm willing to back off on this other customer for a week. In other words, they understand that capacity is not infinite, and the people in charge of the capacity understand that demand is not infinite also. In other words, we try to find all the ways to say yes, not the ways to say no. So those are my first 3 points. Continuing on, oops, let me get this right. S&OP also enables supply and demand balancing solutions. Again, back to the how do we balance this out with the exception of the target inventory that we want to have. And it enables a planning structure and also, I might say, a planning discipline. And so S&OP really needs to have these 6 characteristics to be successful. Now, notice that virtually all of those are organizational, cultural, and behavioral at their root. They're not technical. The tools are not what's going to get us there. Here was the actual conclusion that we came to why S&OP success is so elusive in companies. The first one is that it's all about corporate decision makers, is that they understand, they underestimate the complexities involved when predicting demands. The average senior level executive I work with, CEO, CEO, they have no idea how complex it is. They go, look, you know the customer, it's just how hard can it be to predict what they want to buy? Well, everybody knows in supply chain management, you know how complex this is. And because we've looked for years at patterns, that's why we look at historical data. We also the reason why we look at market data and why we buy market research information, because we understand it's incredibly complex and you can't oversimplify it. You shouldn't be simplifying it. I say this to CEOs all the time. Stop simplifying something that's complex. Look, I know how to cut a steak. You know, you hold it down, you take a knife, you cut where you want to. Does it make sense for me to say how hard is it to do open heart surgery? I mean, it's just hold it down, cut it, go. It's incredibly complex. You have to understand where nerves are. You have to understand where muscles are. You have to understand where blood vessels are. You have to understand biology. You have to understand all kinds of things. Just as when I do demand planning or forecasting, I need to understand my competitors. I need to understand my own sales force's capabilities. I need to understand new products and engineering's coming out that might erode old products. I need to understand a lot of things. You can't underestimate the complexities. The second conclusion we came to is that corporate decision makers generally underestimate the complexities involved when scheduling. Oh, this is to me so amazing because in a manufacturing company, I can have a product that goes to work center A and B, and I can actually understand the trade-off issues with work center A to B. If a product comes out of A on late, then B is going to be impacted, right? Work center B is going to be done. And I understand that if B is going to be late, then C can be impacted, work center C. But I can have a product going through A that never uses C, and I can have another product that goes through C that never uses A. And that mix in the factory can mess me up because of the common work centers that things go through. We have a whole course where we talk about the spiderweb complexity of scheduling. And oftentimes it's completely underestimated the amount of complexity. The third is clear. That oftentimes sales and operations planning people, demand planners and master production schedulers, their skills are undervalued. Senior management oftentimes undervalues their skills, experience, and the judgment that's required from individuals engaged in the execution of S&OP. Why? Because the darn software companies have told them if you plug the S&OP advanced planning software tool in or whatever, then everything will work better. And it never, never, never does. Because it takes an enormous amount of judgment as well as detail analytics and critical thinking skills to be at that level of sales and operations planning. And the last one is that S&OP reports to a biased leader. I want to talk more about that now. So how should S&OP fit into a manufacturing enterprise? Well, let me tell you where it needs to report. I will go to my grave on this. It should not report to supply chain. It should not report to marketing and sales. It needs to report to the president and or the COO, maybe the CEO. Sales and operations planning is that organization that really connects strategy with tactics, market-facing strategy with inward capabilities to achieve that strategy. This is that kind of no man's land between strategy and tactics. It's the great connector. And so I will go to my grave saying that sales and operations planning as a function, as a department, a function with master schedulers, with demand planners, and with target inventory specialists, that function needs to report to the president or CEO. And anybody who wants to have a private argument with me, you know how to get a hold of me. I love to have that conversation because the data is very clear. Where this works, where this happens, there's a higher probability, almost 3x better probability of an improved S&OP outcome. You know, the reason for that is an S&OP starts with technical data, but it ends with human judgment. You see, everybody in the blue boxes, the head of supply chain, the head of finance, the head of R&D, the head of quality, head of business development, head of HR, and we could expand that, of course. But those people are in jobs that don't require they do things, but it requires enormous amounts of critical thinking and enormous amounts of judgment, enormous amounts of business acumen, and enormous amounts of what we call systems thinking, understanding how it all these elements of a business fit together. S&OP is the tool that gives them a concise, singular set of data to converse and to talk. S&OP is not the enemy of supply chain, finance, R&D, quality, business, HR, et cetera. It is the tool that puts them on a common playing field. And so S&OP, if this was using a musical metaphor, each of those blue boxes could be an instrument. S&OP is the conductor. Now, he's not the owner of the theater. He's not the owner of the orchestra, but he or she is, in fact, the conductor. And that conductor pulls information, makes sure that information's pulled from marketing, the demographics, the geographics, the psychographics of buyer demand, customer demand, the competitive pressures, the price elasticities, all that. Sales, it pulls historic data from what is sold, what is not sold. It looks at past forecast error and tries to figure out why to see if it can give insights. On this operations side, it tends to look at past master schedules and firm planned orders and material plans and shortages and inventory management, et cetera. So it turns out that from a sales and operations planning perspective, this job, this S&OP function or department is a tough job. S&OP replaces demand and supply functional biases with a bias towards enterprise valuation enhancement. Think of that as stock price, if you will. In other words, the reason it can't report to supply chain or can't report to marketing and sales is because it can't have biases. This is why it has to report to the individual who is measured on the performance of the enterprise, not the performance of purchasing, or not the performance of planning, or not the performance of sales or marketing, but on the enterprise valuation. So S&OP is really kind of the power conversion process in a manufacturing company. So if you look at our view here, this is a view of the undercarriage of a car. So on the very front, you'll see that we have the power source, the engine. On the very back, we've got the drive wheels, and you see that kind of drive shaft. But in the very middle, we have this power converter called a transmission. And that transmission job is to convert raw power to usable power, depending on the environment, going up a hill, down a hill, flat. And so the driver's hand is on the stick shift, and the driver's hand, working with the driver's brain and all his or her other senses, knows when to shift to convert power in a slightly different way. Power is one thing. Usable power is a far more important subject, isn't it? And so it's the sales and operations planning function that is that person with their hand on the stick shift. We have to understand the sales. We have to understand our ability to move the production through, and then we have to be able to add more firm planned orders in or take firm planned orders out in order to meet our requirements. So that takes us to an inspiration. One of the beautiful things about working at Caltech, and so I've run my own company, but I've been teaching at Caltech for about 36 years. So California Institute of Technology and their Center for Technology and Management Education, where we take business leaders and we apply principles and inspirations from science and sometimes science fiction as well. And so here's kind of a picture of what the Knights of the Round Table from a fictional story. And I got thinking one day about the metaphor of sales and operations planning, kind of like the Knights of the S&OP Round Table. So, you know, one of these individuals you're looking at might be a salesperson. Another one might be a production scheduler. Another one might be a buyer. Another one might be a customer. Another one might be a supplier. And all of these elements are what it takes to, you know, create this great Knights of the Round Table. Except we don't have them sitting around a round table, but we have lots of data that can take their place. One day I was in a sewage treatment plant and I was in a control room and I noticed this gentleman there sitting there with 4 screens in front of him. And, you know, one of them was about sewage inflow, another was sewage outflow, another one was processing, another one had to do with ordering and the supply of chlorine and all kinds of other chemicals. It looks like on the right side there, you can kind of see what looks like an MRP output on the screen, or a bucketed chart on the screen. And I went into a chemical manufacturing facility and I noticed this big control center. And most big chemical manufacturers have this. You'll notice that there are icons for every valve, pipe, pump, a reactor, everything is there, and they can see how it all connects together. And they actually sit there and they work. And when they have meetings to talk about output, they don't do them in some conference room around the corner. They do them in that room. And they can drill down and see everything they want. And then at Caltech, I took this picture in the Jet Propulsion Center's control room. And so this is their mission control for every deep space probe, everything that's a remote space vehicle anywhere in the universe, mostly the solar system, of course, but anything they have out there, and also every antenna that receives data from that, receives and sends data to and from that remote vehicle. So you can look closely and you can see some actual photographs. So there's actually a video feed there in the middle of a radio and telescope or a radio antenna somewhere. Same thing over on the very far right. And then there's icons over to kind of to the left of middle there that show you a little bit about the people in the control room, about what's going on. Then there's a bunch of data streams that appear to be color coded. This is the way they control things and don't have them run into one another. And that got me thinking. I thought about all 4 of those and I thought, let's be inspired here by this. And I came up with the idea, along with some of my colleagues, of the S&OP control room. Kind of the Knights of the S&OP Roundtable, where you've got the forecasting professional, the trigger card analyst, because it was a JIT environment, order entry and master scheduling, all working together so they all know what's going on. And this is the design of the room. This is the graphic room. We actually built 2 of these now, working with clients. And this is the room. So if you take a look at the top of the schematic, those are big LED screens and they're stacked. So at the very middle, at the top, we have, this is the table is where all the people work. At the top of the screen, we have the unit demand and supply. It's just a graph that shows this is the demand rate, this is the supply rate. And then below it, it does it in dollars. So top screen is units. You always forecast in units. You always schedule in units. But then we convert it to dollars, to economics. To the left of that, we see the demand modeling, the background, the algorithms and work, and things called demand perpetrators. So that is the role of that demand planner that you see down there in the middle. Demand planner's job is to make sure everybody understands the demand perpetrators, things that are creating demand. And then on the far left is demand issues, things that come up that we want. If I, as the demand planner, want to know it, I want everybody else to know it. On the right, you see the big LED screen for the MPS modeling, and then the work center utilizations, work center by work center. Usually it's that bottom screen on the WC utilizations. That's literally the utilization rates for every work center in the factory or group of factories, and then supply issues. On the left and right side of the room, you see on the left side, you see the anticipated delay report. This is actually nothing more than a whiteboard where people from anywhere in the company can come in and write. You know, machine and work center 18 is squealing. That's not a good thing. Maybe we should look at it. And if that work center happens to be a bottleneck typical work center, that sends a signal to the master scheduler that maybe I need to schedule around that, get maintenance involved. On the right side, this is a board, oftentimes a screen, but could be a board. And this is just where we put notes and things that we want to communicate to others. Sometimes that's nothing more than the sum of all the email traffic going back and forth from these people. At the table, we have the S&OP leader sitting in the middle with a couple computer screens, maybe 4 computer screens, controlling everything that you see up on that in the front there. Same thing with the demand planner to his or her left and the master production scheduler or schedulers to the right. Production analyst and target inventory analysts on each end. These are just, and you could have obviously other people in there as well. Now at the back of the room, you take 2 steps up, or from the back of the room, you take 2 steps down. So in other words, the back of the room is elevated, and this is where you have the S&OP constituents. And so when you have your regular monthly meetings, you do it in the room with the data. This is so basic, but so overlooked in most companies. And so people come in, they sit on that elevated platform at the back, the people turn around, they flip their computer screens around. So they're now looking at all of the people, the constituents at the back of the room. The constituents are looking at them and looking over their head at the data behind them. Everything that's behind them is on those screens, and that's how they conduct their meetings. Pretty cool, don't you think? And this idea of emission control, if it works for multi-billion-dollar chemical plants, if it works for jet propulsion labs, if it works for NASA Houston mission control, if it works in a sewage treatment plant, it ought to work in sales and operations planning. And today, all the technical tools to do this are very inexpensive. I mean, seriously inexpensive relative to 10 or 20 years ago. So there's no reason why we can't do this, except that a lot of executives think S&OP is just some pedestrian set of functions that nobody, you know, all you need is 2 years of production scheduling and planning or sales background. And by the way, you need to know how to use Excel and maybe have a week or a year out in the sales force in the marketplaces. And you should be able to do all of this. And that's just baloney. This is difficult to do, but it works. I've personally been in Caltech's jet propulsion labs. They run it for NASA. I've personally been there in 3 or 4 historic occasions. You know, landing of the first Mars rover, I was in the room and watched how it all came together. Landing the Mars Space Laboratory, the big one, not the current one, but the one before it. I was there when that landed. I was there when some of them took off from Cape Canaveral. It's amazing how it all works together, and we should draw some inspiration from this. So if we can, if it works for those, why won't it work for us? We ought to be thinking about that. So let me wrap this up with some final thoughts. S&OP, like all other elements in supply chain management, has technical, organizational, cultural, and behavioral elements. Those technical elements, as I said, are the forecasting, the inventory management, the master scheduling tools that are integrated in the bigger ERP system, the bigger ERP environment, especially those tools that are used for simulation. Organization is about the S&OP office's needs to report to an unbiased senior leader, preferably the president. Culturally, S&OP's process needs to exist within a formal and disciplined framework. What that means is, I'm making some numbers up here, but the second Tuesday of the month is the preliminary forecast meeting. The second Friday of the month is the final forecast meeting. The master schedule preliminary meeting is the third Thursday of the month, and the final is the fourth Monday of the month. And then all the data is published. In other words, there's a discipline to it. There's an absolute discipline to it that doesn't get missed at all. Behaviorally, the S&OP professional should always search for ways to say yes to demand, but when the desired solutions are not possible, no means no. So when someone comes and says, I know we're out of capacity, but my customer needs this, can we do it? The answer shouldn't be no. The answer should be, give me 24 hours. Let me find all the ways possible to say yes. And 24 hours goes by, it's like, I'm really sorry. I tried everything, outsourcing, insourcing, moving from one factory to, I tried everything. It's just not possible. So no means no. S&OP is our final comment in terms of critical insights. S&OP is the power conversion process in a manufacturing company. It's what converts demand into enterprise valuation through efficient supply. So I don't want you to forget about that picture of the transmission being the power converter, and that's what you as S&OP. If you have a car without a transmission, it's going to be good for one thing. It's either going to be geared to go uphill, it's going to be geared to go downhill, or geared to go straight, but it's not going to be able to be agile enough to do all three. That's why you have a transmission instead of just a direct connect to the rear wheels. Remember, power is one thing. Usable power, usable capability is a far more important subject. And that's it for the presentation. And this is where we get to open it up for questions. Anybody have any questions before we wrap up tonight? Any questions?
Alan, I have a question.
Sure.
This is, I mean, perfectly, I mean, I understand the inspiration and the structure that you put it is really good. Excellent way of looking at it. But let's say the manufacturing scenarios or environment like made to order, made to stock, or engineered to order, do we need to tweak a lot in this process, or will it more or less the same process, but at a different level of planning?
Yes, it is. It's more or less the same process. It's just your units of performance on a make to stock are obviously units product, right? But in a make to order, it's really units of capacity, isn't it? So it's kind of where you start. If I'm making something to order, I actually have to start with an understanding of capacity and both capacity and utilization. So I have to have good, solid data about what is my true theoretical capacity and what's my true reasonable or usable capacity. So there's 8,760 hours in the year for any machine in your factory or any work center in your factory. It doesn't mean you can all be scheduled, right? And so in fact, the more you move to a configured product or a make to order product, the more you have to say, I shall never routinely schedule over, pick a number, 75%, because I don't know the rate of flow. And so it's because it's the rate of flow, not the magnitude of flow of demand, that's my challenge. So I cap it at 75%, say, of theoretical. And then I say, okay, now I need to understand what does it really take to make it. There's where job standards or operation standards are really important when we do the engineering of the product, or if it's an option-oriented product, I need to understand what it really takes. So I understand how much of capacity I'm consuming. You know how MRP consumes inventory at any period of time. In a make to order, you're consuming capacity, and you need, of course, know your bottleneck. So it's fundamentally the same model. It's just the conversations in that S&OP room are different. I was just this morning, I was just around the corner at a company that makes generators. When I say generators, I mean generators that are 15 feet tall and 65 feet long, and they're used in huge chemical processing environments. And so, I mean, there's $5 million of copper in any one of these generators. And so and they make them purely to order, purely to spec. They claim they have not made a single one identical, but 90% of everything they've made is the same. It's just that extra 10%. So when they master schedule, they're only talking about capacity to a large extent. And then that capacity availability is what drives the master production schedule, which then drives the MRP instead of the other way around. In other words, MRP presumes, as you all know, infinite capacity, And whereas in finite planning, you tend to presume that it's not infinite. So same process, same organization structure, different terminology, different language, but in the same room. Great question, by the way.
That's
Really
great.
great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, come on, there's got to be at least one more question there. Right?
So
I have
what,
one. This
Oh,
is
there's one.
Machi. This is Machi from Evoqua. Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for a very informative session. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
It's even better. This is free. So, so I appreciate that. My question is, our organization, the concept side of thinking is the problem solver. When you're in engineer to order business, it's not, PsyOps is not your totally problem solver. In my experience, I agree with you. The most I can plan is capacity. I cannot even get ahead on the material unless the engineer get released. So that's our situation. But in our leadership team, they think we need a magic tool. If we have a tool, all these problems are solved.
Right.
So in your opinion, what are the magic tools out there you would recommend?
Oh, such a really great question. I don't believe in magic tools, but I do believe in mastering of basics. So, did you say this is an engineer to order business?
Yes.
Okay, so engineer to order business means excellence in project management, doesn't it? Project managers are miniature CEOs.
Absolutely, yes.
And so duration, if you think about a project PERT chart, all it really is a work center bar chart turned sideways, right? It's just kind of a bill of material in a sense, but it's a bill of resources. And so
Correct.
What's really important for project management is to understand what the real durations of each task is going to be. Because in a build to order, engineer to order, you absolutely have to disconnect the actual project itself from the master schedule. And so we need to know, imagine a project chart, whether it's a network chart or a Gantt chart or whatever, but imagine at certain points in that chart, you actually have identification which says, okay, all the documentation is done, all the engineering is done, and here's the key. What's the evidence that it's done? Now, this is important because you know and I know that engineers have a different definition of the word complete than us people in supply chain.
Yep.
When they say, yeah, the design's complete, great. Can I see the bill of material? Yeah, haven't actually finished that yet. Well, how about a parts list? Yeah, there's still some red line. Well, it's not complete then. The design is not complete if you don't have the bill of material, the parts identified, and probably even the production router, the sequence resources. If you haven't done that, then it's not complete. So one of the things we put in every build to order environment, we actually, in every project and program plan, we actually have a step called evidence that prior design step is done. And the evidence, we identify what it is. Drawings approved, bills of material approved, parts lists approved, maybe critical suppliers approved too. And sometimes we do that, sometimes we don't. And so, and then once that's done, that's the input to your master schedule. Because remember what your master schedule is doing for the factory. Your master scheduler is trying to figure out not the sequence of one product going through the factory in a build to order or engineer to order, but the sequence of a bunch of them going across common work centers. And so I as the master scheduler, demand is one thing, but in master scheduling in a build to order or a build to print environment, I have to imagine what's going to bottleneck at some common work centers. It's in build to order, it's not the volume, it's the mix that can kill you, right? And so I have to have the evidence of when a task is complete so I can then start ordering the material and ordering the parts. Again, the language in the S&OP room changes, but the discipline doesn't. So that's, to me, that's that's the key. We did this for a large shipbuilding company where they build 3 ships a year, literally 3 ships a year. But the problem is you only have 3 ships, but you only have 2 dry docks. So you have to sequence things. So when one comes out, another one can pop in. And so everything was about planning. As one of my colleagues said, gee, this isn't about planning parts. This is about planning real estate usage. And then we decide when the parts are going to, because what you don't need is you don't need 400 tons of steel to show up that's not going to be used for 18 months. And so the logic was you only have so much real estate. So everything was driven on that project by how not to clutter up the site with inventory that was there more than 2 weeks before it was actually needed. And so in a sense, the capacity planning, the tool planning, all of that happened. And then the derivative of that was the material planning, not the other way around. Great question. Any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
Yeah, I have one more. This is a little different. Let's say that we're all, we understand, and definitely the S&OP is the key. But let's say for all the people who try to follow the S&OP, looking at the current shortage of the semiconductor chips, what is the lessons learned for all this? So-called all this planning happened, but still things happen. What's the lessons?
Yeah, so I'm deeply involved in an analysis right now, 2 analyses right now for 2 different clients on this very same issue. A little bit of background, 2019, it looked like the chip order base was flattening out, leveling out. There was, at the end of 2019, there were 17 wafer fabrication facilities around the world that had no equipment in them. They were built, by the way, a wafer fab is about $3.5 billion to build. So they overbuilt, so they just didn't populate them with equipment. So guess what happens? Then COVID comes along, and the immediate logic is the economies are going to shut down, and so there's going to be a huge shortage, or it should be a huge surplus of supply. And so every one of the chip manufacturers cut back. And guess what you all did during COVID? You bought more computers.
More.
You bought more. You did exactly the opposite. An enormous failure in demand planning. I've had this conversation already with four of the 5 largest chip. Look, most semiconductors, I think 77% of the global marketplace for semiconductors is 4 companies that produce them. And there's 100 other little companies doing the rest. But I've had discussions with 4, maybe there's 5 in there, but I've had discussions with 4 of them, and they all admit, yeah, we completely blew it. Well, how did you blow it? Well, let's go talk to the marketing. One of those companies, we talked with the marketing people, and here's what they said. Well, it was our opinion. I said, did you go and survey customers real quick? Did you go and, in those kinds of businesses, popping $1 million for a market survey or something, those are decisions that don't need any approval. This is the kind of stuff you do, because there's been $30 billion of sales that didn't happen in the last 14 months in the semiconductor industry. $30 billion of lost sales. Now everybody's on allocation, right? And the reason for that is that the semiconductor companies, as much as they hate when I say this, the semiconductor companies' marketing organizations generally all failed at marketing research rigor. And it wasn't like there weren't companies out there going, this is just the opposite's going to happen. There was, even Gartner and some other research organizations were saying in April of 2020 that the big winner out of COVID, if it goes on a year, will be the semiconductor companies. It wasn't. So this is why market research, that's a profession too. The people, the demand planners, depend on people. We have a whole course on this. And, when I'm planning demand, I want to know about the past, the present, the future. So I want to understand, historical evidence or precedents. That's what historical demand data for us, for our company in the industry tells us. But that's not enough. I want to pick up the phone and I want to call customers and I want to call distributors and I want to find out what they're doing. And then I want to sit down, and that's the present. Then I want to sit down and say, okay, let's speculate now. Let's see. 200 million people who used to go to work every day are going to now sit home and work. What might that? Oh, I'll bet that's going to drive up demand of laptops. And in other words, there was no future projection of using good, solid analytic elements and analytic processes and diagnostic rigor. They just relied on historic and present, and it was an industry. So one of my clients said, it's not an industry that was duped, it's an industry that duped itself. And my argument is a good demand planner in almost any company should have been able to ask the right questions. It wasn't the data that was the problem, it was the inability to ask the right questions.
Yeah,
Well,
I think that's the heavy price I think everyone paid for this lack of planning or some.
Right. Yeah. Whereas one of my clients recently said, hey, the good news is there's plenty of pent up demand for the next 2 years now. So, but everybody's short, and it's I mean, good grief. General Motors just announced on Sunday they're shutting down every North American factory for 2 weeks. Every single one. And it's purely around semiconductors.
Yeah.
So think about that. We talk about the bullwhip effect. We wrote a paper in March of last year, and we talked about the triple bullwhip. We said there would be a bullwhip effect in demand from COVID. There would be a bullwhip effect in supply. We've seen that happen. We also said there would be a bullwhip in transportation because all the boats and ships were all in the wrong part of the world. All the containers were in the wrong part of the world. We've seen that in spades. Absolutely. We've seen that happen. What we missed was the bullwhip effect that happened because of government policy that caused people to stay home. And so you didn't get talent in the workplace. Right now, there's like 5 jobs available in the United States for every person on unemployment. So there's a mismatch, obviously, but we didn't see that talent. And then we didn't see the extension of this over nearly 2 years now. So getting closer to 2 years. But these bullwhip effects affect each other. And so we know we can show you solid data that says we have 2 years, at least 2 years, before we get the transportation bullwhip and the talent bullwhip and the demand bullwhip fixed. Supply bullwhip is going to take care of itself over about the next 6-8 months, but it won't solve the problem.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. With that, I would like to thank you all for attending this program. I always appreciate working with ASME or APICS chapters. This is one of my favorite subjects. You can see I'm fairly passionate about it. If you need any additional information, make sure you call me, or even better yet, there is your chapters information or email, or I'm sorry, website at the bottom. Please give them a call and I'm sure they can help you out. By the way, it's for all of you who are in the supply chain world now, great career decision. I mean, being in supply chain now is the place to be. Apex just showed that the starting salaries outside of chemical engineers, some of the best we've ever seen in the history of supply chain and whatever we used to call it. So thank you again.
Thanks, Alan.
Appreciate it.
And thank you everybody for staying in. I know we go a little bit over, but thanks for staying, and a great topic today. So just want to plug in for next month, PDM. We're gonna have Saravana presenting how electric vehicles are going to disrupt supply chain and transform industries. So definitely a very interesting topic. So I would like to see you guys over here as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.